Hello, it's a pleasure for me to sort of move and come to this conference. I couldn't come earlier, unfortunately, but I'm happy to chair this panel. So I'm Laurent Bonnefoy. I work mainly as a political scientist on the Arabian Peninsula, more specifically on Yemen. I have a few connections with Palestine and with Gaza, not only because of for ethical and political reasons, but also because I lived there for 2.5 years in East Jerusalem. But the issues which will be dealt with today are kind of foreign when it comes to my own expertise and my own interest. But I'm really happy to listen to our three speakers now. I sort of reflected on what it meant to have a panel on Gaza. Obviously, when you think about the topic which is yours today and tomorrow, Gaza appears to be a very legitimate case study due to the fact that when you compare it to other areas, it probably is one in which the centrality of experiences of death and displacement are massive. Just to mention the figures, you have over 42,000 deaths which have been recorded in the Gaza Strip over the last year. If you would bring that figure and compare it to the French population, it would be more than 1.2 million people. So this is absolutely massive when it comes to the experience of death. Yet the issue, which is to have a Gaza panel, is probably not self-evident and probably needs to be explained, and I'm sure that we will when you compare it to the topic, which is yours. First of all, the issue of borders and displacement is not absolutely central, or crossing borders is not something which happens to civilians in Gaza due to the fact that they are trapped in a very small territory. And then the other thing, I know that there was some discussion regarding not the opportunity to have a panel, but also the possibility due to a number of political reasons, and the fact that in a way our space as academics is being increasingly constrained when we were talking about the P word, which is Palestine. And I think it's very important that we try to actually be proactive in defending spaces to be able to address a number of issues. Addressing a number of issues obviously means that we try to protect our own academic ethos, accept that there might be differences in interpretation and analysis, but this needs to be, like I've said, protected, because spaces elsewhere, and especially outside of academia, are increasingly constrained. So I'm happy to be able to chair this panel with so three speakers. The first will be Catriona Jarvis. Her presentation is entitled Last Rites, Reflections on International Law, Death, and Bereavement in Gaza. Catriona is a retired judge from the United Kingdom and a writer. She's also the chair of trustees of Mythoria, which is a human rights charity with a focus on refugees. So you'll have 20 minutes to present, around 20 minutes, if that's fine. And then we'll hear the other speakers, and then have save some time for debate and exchange. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Laurent, for that kind introduction. And I'm really pleased to be here today with you all and to have the opportunity to speak briefly about this important subject. In the short time available today, I propose to highlight law that is relevant to govern the behaviour of those involved in what will be referred to as the conflict between Hamas and Israel that has taken place since the 7th of October 2023, with a focus on the rights of civilians and breaches of those rights. Frequently, if not always, conflict results in forced migration. In these circumstances, we're considering forced repeated displacement, As Laurent has just said, the borders are not open in this case. Given time constraints and given that this is not a gathering of lawyers, there won't be a detailed consideration of finer points of law, you'll be pleased to know. I'm not going to discuss whether or not there's a war or whether or not there's a right to self-defense or the ultimate extent of that right to defense. Yes? Yeah? Down? How's that? Is it better? Yeah. International human rights law and international humanitarian law are traditionally two separate branches of law, one dealing with the protection of persons from abusive power, the other with the conduct of parties to an armed conflict. Over time, developments in international and national jurisprudence and practice have led to the recognition that these two aspects of law both share common ideals of dignity and integrity, and they overlap to a high degree in practice. The most frequent examples are situations of occupation or non-international armed conflict, where human rights law complements the protection provided by humanitarian law. And I want to quote it at some length because it situates us very well from a piece by the Chief Legal Officer of the International Committee of the Red Cross on war and what we make of the law. And I quote, "Preventing the catastrophic human cost of war is a central purpose of modern international law. Some norms, like those found in the UN Charter, set out to eliminate war altogether, requiring the peaceful resolution of disputes instead. Other rules, like those found in the Geneva Conventions, step in to protect us when all else has failed. The conventions, which every country has joined, are at the heart of the law of armed conflict, a set of rules that constrain the behaviour of warring parties during a conflict, no matter how it might have started and no matter who is at fault. Understood in simplest terms, the law of armed conflict acknowledges that both sides will inevitably kill, injure, detain, and destroy, but it prohibits them from dehumanizing their adversary. Turning this apparent contradiction into binding rules is the work of the Geneva Conventions and a multitude of other treaties and norms. They confront the dilemma of making war humane, not by pretending to resolve it, but by setting an equilibrium between two irreconcilable imperatives, military necessity and our common humanity. A vast set of rules threads this needle across all facets of warfare, targeting, the choice of weapons, detention, interrogation, prosecution and punishment, caring for the wounded and the sick, and the treatment of populations under a party's control, just to name a few. And in each category, international humanitarian law sets an outer limit of acceptable behaviour, a boundary drawn for the simple reason that stepping over it would efface our humanity in a way that even war cannot justify. Some acts are always prohibited: torture, rape, taking hostages, targeting civilians and the wounded. In other areas, the rules are more nuanced. Incidental civilian casualties must be avoided, or at least minimized. And where they are unavoidable, they are subject to strict limitations. International humanitarian law is realistic about how much killing and destruction will inevitably occur in war. But there is a difference between the law assuming a degree of violence and the law enabling it. International humanitarian law draws red lines. It does not set standards for model behaviour." End quote. So today, rather than consider matters from the perspective of either Hamas or Israel, the suggested perspective is that of civilians, who, as Kenneth Roth has put it, remain civilians even when they are endangered by those who have power over them. And for a more in-depth reading, I recommend his article, Crimes of War in Gaza. The ICRC study of customary international humanitarian law, published in 2005, is an exhaustive and updating online resource of the rules and practice applying to armed conflict. These rules apply whether or not the state is a signatory to all the treaties that cover war and armed conflict, And these standards are not merely aspirational. They were drafted by leading militaries, reflecting their view of the best way to protect civilians. And virtually every government, including the United States, Israel, and Palestine, has endorsed them, either by formally ratifying them or by incorporating their standards into their military codes. And the ICRC study that I mentioned sets out 161 binding rules and their interpretation in treaty laws. Rule number 1 is the principle of distinction between civilians and combatants. The parties to the conflict, excuse me, the parties to the conflict must at all times distinguish between civilians and combatants. Attacks may be directed only against combatants. Attacks must not be directed against civilians. Hamas's 7th of October 2023 attack on Israel, in which some 1,200 people were killed and more than 3,300 wounded, plus, of course, some 240 taken hostage, was a blatant violation. International humanitarian law prohibits killing or abducting civilians. It considers such acts grave breaches or war crimes. Hostages in Gaza have been shot dead by their captors, subject to inhumane treatment and other serious harm. It's thought that more than 120 soldiers and civilians, dead and alive, continue to be held. Palestinians in Israeli detention facilities have been tortured, abused, held incommunicado, and subject to sexual violence. In response to Hamas's attack, Israel has invaded Gaza and embarked on a military operation that has caused an enormous loss of life and leveled much of the enclave, which had been home to 2.1 million Palestinians. International humanitarian law requires taking all feasible precautions to minimize harm to civilians. And as has been indicated, the Gaza Ministry of Health reports more than 42,000 deaths in the Strip since the 7th of October last year, of which a high number are women and children. And in addition to the civilian deaths and in the region of 100,000 severe injuries, there have been attacks on civilian structures, including hospitals and places where civilians have been sheltering, such as schools and refugee camps. Sorry, my voice is going. It's okay. International humanitarian law also prohibits firing even on a known military target when the harm caused to civilians would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. This is called the rule of proportionality. It obviously leaves room for interpretation, but it must nevertheless have meaning. On the 21st of April 2024, after the discovery of a mass grave at Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis, which had been occupied by Israeli troops, Professor William Shebas of the Middlesex University, London, stated that mass graves have, and I quote, always been an indication that war crimes have been committed, whether in the former Yugoslavia, Ukraine, and now in Gaza, end quote. In June 2024, the BBC reported on a mass grave site of at least 4 mass graves discovered at the Al-Shifa Hospital of decaying and decomposed, many now unidentifiable bodies, and many hundreds still missing and unaccounted for. Chapters 35 and 36 of the ICRC report concern duties to the dead and the missing, and these include to search and collect for the dead, to prevent the dead being despoiled and mutilated, the return of remains and personal effects of the dead, disposal of the dead in a respectful manner and their graves respected and properly maintained, accounting for the dead and the missing. And we can see in the present situation, in what is reported, that there is little or no possibility of these rules being honoured. Under the statute of the International Criminal Court, intentionally directing attacks against the civilian population as such, or against individual civilians not taking direct part in hostilities, constitutes a war crime, including in non-international armed conflict. In the Qasem case in 1969, Israel's military court sitting at Ramallah recognized the immunity of civilians from direct attack as one of the basic rules of international humanitarian law. Israel would, and indeed does say, of course, that it is not directly targeting civilians, but that civilian deaths are an inevitable consequence, and their own planned actions are assessed and implemented, always to minimize the loss of civilian life, with direct involvement of the IDF's Human Rights Legal Department. For all that careful application of humanitarian law, there are significantly more civilian than combatant deaths, in a death toll currently approaching, as we've said, 42,000. The true number of the dead is unknown, as many bodies remain trapped beneath rubble, while many others have been so atomized that it will prove impossible to identify them. High numbers of people are clinically traumatized, including clinicians themselves and aid workers. Everyone still trapped in Gaza, unable to flee, lives with the daily nightmare that today may be the last day, or that their family are killed. The severity and scale of psychological, emotional, and physical harm from such relentless and remorseless attacks, and the imminent risk of death in civilian areas, despite the International Court of Justice interim orders to cease, cannot be overestimated. Whatever the norms and legal principles, be they based in human rights or in humanitarian law, treaty or customary humanitarian law, duties toward the civilian dead, as well as to combatants, apply. Israel has also regularly characterized civilians who've been killed as enemy combatants, assisting combatants, and shielding combatants. However, such deaths may be classified by Israel, and whether directly targeted or collateral, the duties to those who are killed are clearly stated in the Geneva Conventions and customary humanitarian law. And I give just an example here. Parties to the conflict shall further ensure that the dead are honorably interred, if possible according to the rites of the religion to which they belonged, that their graves are respected, grouped if possible according to the nationality of the deceased, properly maintained and marked so that they may always be found. And there are similar provisions in other Geneva Conventions, which also apply in relation to prisoners of war and internees who die in captivity. Whenever circumstances permit, and particularly after an engagement, all possible measures shall be taken without delay to decently dispose of the dead. The notion of outrages on personal dignity is defined in the elements of crime for the International Court as acts which humiliate, degrade, or otherwise violate the dignity of a person to such a degree as to be generally recognized as an outrage upon personal dignity. The elements of crimes further specifies that degrading treatment can apply to dead persons and that the victim need not be personally aware of the humiliation. Elements of crime for the International Criminal Court, definitions of outrages upon personal dignity, and in particular humiliating and degrading treatment as a war crime. And that's from their statute. What we are witnessing and the evidence on which basis the International Court of Justice has ordered a cessation of hostilities so far in relation to the genocide proceedings brought by South Africa against Israel does not accord with Israel's own assessment of its actions as lawful and proportionate and targeted only at enemy combatants. Indeed, whether Israel's asserted right to self-defense is based in international law rather than a general moral basis is itself disputed by international lawyers and legal scholars. But there isn't time here, nor do I profess the personal expertise to develop that argument. But the legal basis of the military actions by Israel following the Hamas attacks will be, ultimately, acutely significant when assessing both the lawfulness and unlawfulness of its actions as a whole, and regarding specific individual attacks, as well as the conduct of its forces, its strategic decisions, and the consequences of those actions. What we need to focus on, it suggested, are the rights and duties as they are affected in the ongoing, persistent devastation of Gaza, far beyond any meaningful notion of self-defense. The 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the bedrock of human rights law, provides that the recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. And Article 1 of that declaration states that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. The right to life, to truth, and to justice are essential elements of the maintenance and protection, not just of other human rights, but of dignity itself. The civilian death toll in Gaza is unarguably extreme, of children especially, and the suffering off the scale in all aspects in an already prejudiced existence. The expectation of injury, loss, and death is immediate and ever-present. Disproportionality, the ratios of civilian casualties to combatants, cold-blooded assessments of targets and acceptable losses already remove any real sense of humanity and human dignity. The blocking of aid, including food and water, as well as medical supplies, bombing of hospitals, universities, schools, evacuation camps, and demolition of cemeteries mean that the very essence of dignity is under attack and undermined in the way the retaliation is being conducted. The growing number of mass graves, starvation, and emergency surgery without hygiene or anesthetics, killing of doctors, journalists, and aid workers, and so many other documented acts of extreme violence force the most undignified suffering and existence onto those who remain alive. The living are unable to bury their loved ones, still under mountains of rubble where homes once stood. The documenting of the dead, the recording of their deaths, funeral rituals, and mourning made all but impossible are undeniably contrary to both humanitarian law and fundamental human rights norms. Whether Israel categorizes those killed as innocent civilians or not innocent participants in this conflict, the duties to the dead apply in both circumstances to recover and identify the bodies, provide individual grave markers, enable appropriate religious and cultural and ritual burial, to protect burial grounds, to maintain records of the dead and the cause of their death. Where human dignity is not protected, there are, as we have seen, no depths to which humanity is not capable of sinking. History tells us this, as well as the many contemporary conflicts. And one of the ultimate, possibly the only ultimate protections for human dignity is the prevention of impunity. The knowledge, at least, that there may one day be a reckoning, an accountability, even reparations. These are a long way off, and our international legal order is being destabilized, not just by the actions we witness through the reporting in a few news outlets, such as Al Jazeera, and the social media images from those caught in the conflict, but by states, some of them the architects of our international legal order, seeking to sanction the International Court of Justice, rejecting its rulings and doing nothing as member states to uphold its orders. We see a human rights framework that is being shaken to its very core, yet we must make sure that it survives. For without any mechanism of accountability, without any independent judicial reference point as to the implementation of international law, states are free to act not only with impunity, but arbitrarily, self-selecting what they consider justifiable. The right to life, as human rights law enshrines, necessarily frames our rights in relation to the deaths of our loved ones, our communities, and ourselves. Without such a fundamental right, there is no value placed on human dignity. We can all be disposed of when it's convenient, without consequence. Israel's starvation strategy was a focus of the arrest warrants sought by the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court on May 20th in respect of the Israeli Prime Minister and Defense Minister. He also sought warrants for 3 senior Hamas officials for the atrocities of the 7th of October 2023. One of those officials has since been assassinated, and it's understood that the court is likely to grant those warrants in respect of the remaining. As was noted by Kenneth Roth, in theory, each side can prosecute its own war criminals, and the International Criminal Court is supposed to defer to conscientious national prosecutions of war crimes. But it is unlikely that Hamas would do so, and the Israeli government has no history of prosecuting senior officials for abusive wartime practices. Whether in law the death toll in Gaza is an unfortunate byproduct of war or a reflection of Israeli misconduct is a question to be decided elsewhere. Both the International Criminal Court and the Court of Justice will no doubt pass final judgment in due course. But I note that the International Court of Justice has on 3 occasions ordered Israel to prevent genocide against Palestinians and let necessary aid enter Gaza. On the 19th of July, the ICJ handed down its advisory opinion on the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian West Bank and East Jerusalem, which it held to be unlawful and to have deprived the Palestinian people of the right to self-determination. When we stand up for the rights of the living in Gaza by recording every death, by seeing not the numbers but the individuals killed, by demanding that the dead are treated with the fullest dignity we can offer, by demanding accountability for those deaths, we also stand up for all of humanity and for the rule of law as the only tool we ultimately have against barbarity. The recent escalation of hostilities across the Middle East is putting more civilians at risk. All civilians, whether in Palestine, Lebanon, or Israel, are entitled to protection, dignity, and justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catriona, for this this analysis and this focus on matters linked to international humanitarian law. I'll pass the microphone to Yumna Masarwa, who will focus on funerary rites in Gaza in the context of war. Yumna is the Dean of the School of Arts at the American College of the Mediterranean, which is the Institute for American Universities in Aix-en-Provence, in the south of France. She's been conducting a series of research and ethnographies, especially on burial and body repatriation among Algerians in France. And so her focus will move to Gaza, and will be a continuation of the endeavor that this panel has constructed, is one which focuses on first of all the last rites, which is the rites of the dead, and then we'll hear Sid talk about first rites.
Good afternoon. Do you hear me? To break the silence in this room, I must say that the chairs are noisy and annoying. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers and conveners of this conference, Bidisha, Judith, and Thomas. I also would like to thank Laurent Bonnefoy for chairing this panel, and he's going to be kind and give me 2-3 minutes extra. Third, I would like to thank my partners in crime, Catriona and Sid. And finally, I would like to thank you for being here. Before I start my talk, I would strongly recommend you to listen and follow the slides, which will help you to get the best out of it. Let's go. I will begin my talk by reading out a poem by Dr. Khawla Badwan, a professor at Manchester Metropolitan University. The poem is titled Rice Bag, and it was written 2 months ago. It reads as follows. I saw a child's remains in a rice bag, shredded into nothing but 3 kilos, placed in a rice bag that remains half empty. I saw a child's remains in a rice bag. Oh, my little one, you were not buried whole. Remains, parts, pieces, like my witnessing heart. I saw a child's remains in a rice bag. Oh, rice bag, what has become of us? Held by a father, digging a grave where humanity also lies. It has been 1 year since October 7th, 2023. 1 full year of unfathomable levels of death and destruction in Gaza. Official counts point to over 42,000 Gazans killed, over 97,000 injured, over 10,000 buried under the rubble. Over 900 families have been exterminated and taken off of the civil registry, and over 17,000 children have lost one or both parents. There is even an acronym that is unique to the Gaza Strip. It is WCNSF, Wounded Child, No Surviving Family. Many see these numbers as underestimates. In July 2024, a study in the British medical journal, The Lancet, argued that approximately 186,000 Gazans will be killed by the end of 2024, even if the war had stopped that summer. Gazans refer to those who lost their lives in Israeli attacks as martyrs, shaheeds. Islamic funerary rituals bear significant importance within the Gazan community and offer mourners some dignity and closure while grieving. Based on UN reports, first-hand journalist reports from Gaza, published interviews with Gazan corpse washers and morgue directors, visual evidence, international media investigations and forensic analysis, and published academic articles, this talk examines how the war has violently upended funeral rituals in Gaza and disrupted any proper opportunity for Gazans to bury their dead when tens of thousands are killed and there is no cemetery, no graveyard. I argue that the ongoing war on Gaza has destroyed the structure of death, its spatial and temporal domains, its human relations, and its collective emotional rituals. All of this has resulted in new transformations in the relations of life and death and the borders separating them. Moreover, the relentless bombardment, the sheer number of casualties, and the shortage of shrouds and cemeteries have made funerals and grieving impossible in Gaza. I will first address Islamic funerary rites in Gaza before October 7th, 2023. Then I will discuss how Gazans struggled to bury their dead during the war while facing unprecedented daily challenges. Lastly, I will end with some concluding remarks reflecting on the status quo. Let me have a sip of water. In Islam, taking care of the corpse is mandatory. The washing and the shrouding of the dead body are central aspects of Islamic funerary rites and are considered to be essential elements of respect and honor for the corpse. Islamic funerary rites consist of 3 phases: the washing and the shrouding of the deceased, the funeral prayer, and the burial. These rites have to be performed as soon as possible, as the Prophet Muhammad said, hasten the funeral rites. This prophetic tradition is echoed in the widespread Muslim saying of honoring the deceased is burying him. The question of when is the funeral almost does not exist in Muslim society. It is known and understood that the family will bury the deceased immediately. In Gaza, before the war, funerals had rituals that were followed. First, the corpse was washed with water and soap twice, then a third time using camphor. Second, it was wrapped in 3 different white shrouds. Third, the body was taken from the morgue to the family home where women were able to bid a final farewell. Fourth, the corpse was taken to the mosque where dozens or hundreds of people would pray over the deceased before carrying them to the cemetery to be buried in a single individual grave with a marble headstone bearing the name of the deceased. The ongoing war on Gaza is the most violent and the bloodiest of the 5 wars launched by Israel against Gaza over the course of 15 years. Morgue supervisors and corpse washers state that they have been receiving hundreds of bodies on a daily basis since the assault began. Under these circumstances, they don't have the time or means to perform the customary funerary rites mentioned above. Instead, The sheer number of casualties has resulted in rushed funeral rites. The deceased are shrouded, prayed over, and buried. The body is not washed. It is shrouded immediately in one piece of fabric instead of three, and the blood is wiped away from the deceased faces. Torn body parts are wrapped first in a plastic covering in order not to cause stains, and then covered with a shroud. The name of each deceased is written on the shroud. The funeral prayer is performed on hospital grounds immediately after the body is shrouded, attended by only a few people or anyone who's available. It is important to point out that the morgues across the Gaza Strip supervise the process of preparing the bodies for burial and handing them over to the families if the identity of the deceased is known. When the identity of the deceased is unknown and the body is unclaimed, then the resting place is the emergency cemetery. Based on experiences from previous wars, the Endowment Properties Office built an emergency cemetery in the Shujaiya neighborhood in Gaza City on an area of 13,000 square meters, which contained 500 to 700 reserve graves at the time the war broke out. Within 10 days of the start of the war, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, reported that there are not enough body shrouds for the dead in Gaza, and the death toll continues to rise. Morgues were overwhelmed and bodies were piling up in hospital corridors and courtyards. Cemeteries filled up and no available space existed for a new burial. So, how do the Gazans bury their dead under these circumstances? What alternatives do they have while facing the difficulties in keeping up with the daily numbers of victims and having no means to care for them appropriately? In what follows, I will present the challenges faced by the Gazans to bury their dead and the alternatives they have found. Gaza City, the largest and most densely populated Gaza city in the Strip, suffers from an insufficiency of land that can be converted into cemeteries. The city has 11 cemeteries, 9 of which were closed due to full capacity even before the war broke out. The remaining 2 cemeteries, as well as the emergency cemetery, rapidly filled up and have no more room. In light of this difficult reality, the local authorities resorted to an alternative to the customary individual graves, which require space and equipment, by digging mass graves in the emergency cemetery using parallel lines and burying the dead at a depth of only 1 meter. Some families had to dig up long buried bodies and deepen the holes to make space for new victims. Other families were forced to bury their dead in archaeological cemeteries. Some even dug graves and buried their loved ones in the streets, on the sidewalks, and even at homes. It is worth mentioning here the CNN investigation, which has found that the Israeli military has desecrated at least 16 cemeteries in its ground offensive in Gaza Strip, leaving gravestones ruined, soil upturned, and in some cases, bodies unearthed. Data from the Gaza Media Office indicates that the Israeli army has exhumed about 1,800 graves. In November 2023, Abu Ammar, a corpse washer at the morgue of Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital in the central Gaza Strip, described the situation at the morgues as follows, quote, "Our refrigerators are equipped to receive only 10 bodies. And you can imagine when 100 bodies arriving together, sometimes corpses come to us at night and they must be preserved until the morning. And unknown corpses often come and must be preserved for several days until they are identified. Therefore, ice cream refrigerators and the freezer refrigerators are used. However, these refrigerators have little capacity and do not accommodate the required quantity. End quote. Bodies were piling up in hospital corridors and courtyards. Overflowing morgues have compelled hospitals to bury people before their relatives can claim them. Bodies are being transported to cemeteries in vehicles designated for transporting goods due to the lack of sufficient numbers of appropriate vehicles to transport the dead. In some cases, they used animals to transport the dead bodies. Dozens of unidentified bodies were buried in a mass grave in Khan Yunis. To increase the chances of being identified if they die, Palestinian families began wearing identification bracelets and writing names on their children's body. The shortage of shrouds led to consolidating several family members together in one shroud. Here you see 9 family members with their names on this shroud. Here you see 6 family members with their names in one shroud. This talk could have been entirely dedicated to mass graves in Gaza. Nevertheless, I will discuss the issue briefly here. There are 2 main categories of mass graves in Gaza. Mass graves created by the Gazans as communal or mass burials, and mass graves created by the Israeli army, which are categorized as criminal mass graves following the United Nations definition of a criminal mass grave as a burial site containing 3 or more victims of executions. Due to the large number of martyrs, overflowing morgues, no room in cemeteries, and the difficulty of reaching cemeteries because of the continued indiscriminate bombing of all areas of the Strip, the Gazans were forced to create mass graves containing dozens of martyrs. The first mass grave was created in Al-Shifa Hospital on October 15, 2023, when it became impossible to transfer the dead victims to the official cemetery in Gaza City due to the large number of corpses and danger presented by Israeli forces. The Euromed Human Rights Monitor field teams have documented over 120 mass graves in Gaza, with at least 29 of them located in random areas of the Strip, such as markets, streets, schools, and hospitals. These graves have been established throughout residential areas, in the backyards and courtyards of homes and hospitals, public road intersections, wedding halls, sports fields, schools, markets, and mosques. Palestinian emergency workers uncovered at least 7 mass graves in and around the 3 hospitals across the Gaza Strip, all of which had been under siege by Israeli forces. More than 500 bodies have been recovered, with several showing signs of mutilation and torture. Gazans are desperately trying to find and identify their loved ones through exhumation of these mass graves. They unbury the dead to bury them again, which adds to their suffering and makes grieving impossible. Okay, just to give you an idea, Al-Shifa Hospital was invaded by Israeli forces twice. The first time was in November 2023, which I refer as the first invasion, and March 2024, which I refer to as the second invasion. On November 15, 2023, Israeli soldiers stormed Al-Shifa Hospital. where thousands of civilians had been besieged for days, including premature babies, critically ill patients, displaced families, and medical staff. The hospital ceased to function after the November raid, gradually turning into a displacement shelter for Palestinians. I will elaborate on the mass burials and mass graves at Al-Shifa Hospital using the investigation report of forensic architecture published on October 4th, 2024, as part of their ongoing investigation of Israel's destruction of medical infrastructure in Gaza since October 2023. Forensic architecture released new findings that expand their documentation of the targeting of Al-Shifa Hospital to include the desecration of makeshift burial grounds, including a mass grave within the hospital compound. This satellite image of Al-Shifa Hospital is from April 1st, 2024. In red are the locations of 4 desecrated burial grounds. In yellow are 2 sites of mass graves created by Israeli forces where bodies of Palestinians killed during the second Israeli invasion were exhumed after the army withdrew from the compound. This slide shows the 3 burial grounds and the mass grave within the hospital compound. The photo in the upper right corner, Site A, was taken on November 14, 2023, and we see doctors and civilians digging a mass grave 1 day before the Israeli forces seized the compound. Forensic architecture analysis of visual evidence indicates that 2 makeshift burial grounds, Site A and B, created in late 2023, were desecrated during the Israeli occupation of the hospital compound in March 2024. Here, just to give you a few images. Okay, just to give you an idea, on 14 November 2023, there was a mass grave dug in the compound of Al-Shifa Hospital. 1 day after, November 15, the Israeli invasion, and the next day, November 16, the seizing of the bodies took place. In a video which was filmed on 16 November 2023, Israeli soldiers are seen placing wrapped dead bodies on stretchers after they had taken them out from the hospital's morgue, from a mass grave in the hospital's courtyard, and from a tent where piles of corpses were stored. What interests me here is the fate of these bodies seized by the Israeli forces. These bodies led to the creation of another type of mass grave in Gaza, which I refer to as the blue mass grave. When Israel decides to release the bodies it seized from Gaza, it throws them into containers for shipping goods at the Kerem Shalom crossing in the southern Gaza Strip. Gazan medical authorities receive them in blue bags, and Gazans actually refer to these bags blue trash bags, without any names or identification to bury them in mass graves with numbers. The last of, just to give you an idea, these 4 images were in the New York Times. The last of these were 88 unidentifiable bodies of Palestinians that Israel sent to Gaza on September 25, 2024. Gaza's Ministry of Health stated that the procedures for receiving the container were suspended until Israel provides full data with the victims' names, time of death, and the location they were taken from. However, the bodies are unidentifiable because they are mostly decomposed. They have been transformed into mere numbers and waste. Just to give you some, this is the blue. To summarize, here is my chart of the topography of the mass graves in Gaza. Just to give you an idea, whenever you see white, because you know the shrouds or plastic white is by the Gazans. And whenever you see the blue, you have to get it. These bodies were in Israel and then sent back to Gaza. So here just you see the two. Also the mass graves, if we look from left to right, at the beginning of the first week of the war, from left to the upper left, you have mass grave, then they try to do them only with 1 meter and then 1 square, and then you could see how it goes. Almost done, Laurent. At least 100 Gazans were killed at dawn on August 10th, 2024, after Israeli forces targeted a school in Gaza City whilst displaced people performed morning prayer. Charred bodies and limbs strewn across a concrete floor as people scrambled to find their loved ones following the attack. Gazans could not identify the bodies of their loved ones. They have no forensic means to do that. If the missing person is a child, 15 to 20 kilos of body parts are weighed, and if the missing person is an adult, 70 kilos of body parts are weighed and delivered to the missing person's relatives. In fact, everyone knows that these remains do not belong to any one person, but the victims' families still want to collect the remains of their relatives. When Israel assassinated the journalist Hassan Hamad on October 6, 2024, his body was shredded into pieces, carried in a blue carrier bag and a shoebox by his father, and brought to Kamal Adwan Hospital to be shrouded. The Israeli army launched a renewed assault on Jabalia refugee camp on October 6, 2024, as it seemingly began to implement the so-called General's Plan, which aims to empty northern Gaza of its 400,000 residents to make way for a closed military zone. Hundreds have been killed. Bodies are left in the streets. Heads are blown up, and people are burned alive. Before October 7, 2023, the places designated for the dead were isolated and relegated to the outskirts of cities and neighborhoods in the Gaza Strip, in what is commonly known as the Eastern Cemetery, in reference to a social and architectural structure that sets strict boundaries between the spheres of life and the spheres of death. This war led to the death of the cemetery in Gaza. Death has invaded the lifeline in Gaza. Death is everywhere. It smells death everywhere. The war, oh my God, I thought that I was passing, but okay. The war even dislocated what death itself means, not only the rituals. It had blurred the limits between life and death and disrupted the natural treatment of death in Gaza. Thank you.
Thank you, Yumna, for this presentation, which is heart-crushing. Can't promise that things will look any more positive, but what Sid Bolton wishes to do is to look at the other end of the lifespan, I guess, and look at what he calls first rights. So Sid Bolton is a former lawyer and an author with a focus on refugee rights. He's also a photographer and an activist, and the co-founder of Methoria Active, which is an NGO active across the Mediterranean and internationally, I guess, in particular in Lesbos, but also in France. So his talk will be entitled "First Rights: Reflections on International Law, Death and Bereavement in Gaza."
Thank you, Laurent. Is that on? Am I speaking? Yeah.
You'll have to speak up for this.
Okay. Thank you, Laurent. And can I just also say thank you to our organisers, Thomas, Bidisha, and Judith. And as lawyers and so-called activists, we're quite used to being attacked for our work, sadly, with migrants at borders. And with that in mind, we're very, very much alive to the pressures that academia has been placed under in relation to simply discussing the situation in Gaza. So it's with that in mind that we are very grateful that we have this moment in this conference with this title of this conference to speak about Gaza. And indeed, our work as Methoria, our charity, was born out of the forcible displacement of millions of people from conflict zones such as Syria and Afghanistan coming into mainland Europe from the Aegean Islands. And that very much underpinned a lot of the development of work that we did in terms of identifying rights and standards in relation to the rights of the bereaved and rights in death. And in that work, we found ourselves arguing very much that we should be looking to humanitarian law and practices to build best practice in relation to refugees and migrants. We now find ourselves somewhat in reverse, looking at people who we would ordinarily expect to have fled a region subjected to such violence, but fleeing isn't possible for many reasons, not least a border wall. We've seen border walls on the Arizona border this morning. The wall is integral to keeping people out in different directions for different purposes, but it has ultimately the same deadly effect. So, as Laurent said, I want to talk a little bit about children. It's very hard to follow what Yumna has said and what we've seen as a compelling and chilling illustration of the persistent and almost total denial of a dignified burial and burial rights and mourning rights in Gaza. And as we speak 1 year on, we are now not reflecting on a conflict we hope might have subsided, but one that is fast widening into the region. And it's within that context that we also speak. This conference brings a necessary forensic evidence-based approach to its subject, albeit that is very broadly defined. In Gaza, there's no shortage of technical, highly analysed and scrutinised evidence, and the ongoing and now expanding heavy toll of death and destruction in the region. But access to the territory by external reporters, observers, international agencies, and experts of all kinds is made almost impossible or deadly, and that information gathering and its dissemination is subject to suppression, distortion, or categoric rejection. The lack of reliable evidence, though, is not the biggest problem. It's overwhelmingly present in many ways through conduits like our TV stations and more unfiltered through social media platforms. Its use in terms of preventing further deaths through enabling some kind of accountability and upholding the rule of law, a very much devalued term, I fear, at the moment, is the biggest challenge that we face as an international order. It doesn't compare to the immediate challenges being faced by people who can't escape that violence. And I would say that it's the failure of the international community so far to impose even the basic principles of humanity on this situation, even for the most vulnerable, that is children. That's an indictment of our own political failures and not just the egregious harms perpetrated by those who are involved directly in this conflict. Forensic evidence needs a recognized forum. We had definitions this morning about forensic evidence, but we need a forum that is seen to be legitimate, seen to be recognized, as a place to consider evidence and a place for its adjudication. Without that, what does forensic evidence amount to? On the 9th of February this year, the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child resolved to ask an addendum set of questions of the government of Israel in its periodic reporting cycle on its compliance with the 1989 UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, a universal convention, one that in many respects has become normative in terms of its fundamental rights as they're expressed in relation to children, and is something that Israel has signed and ratified. Last month, on the 19th of September, the Committee on the Rights of the Child published its periodic report and its response in relation to the addendum questions. The coordinator of the CRC's country task force for Israel said that children had consistently comprised around 40% of the total fatalities in Gaza since the 7th of October. And now that's estimated to be, as we've heard, around 17,000 children. A quick check of the CIA World Factbook for this year shows that of the 2.1 million population of the Gaza Strip, the median age of people, that is to say, as many people are of this age as above it, was 19 years and 5 months. It's an extremely young population. In fact, there are only 11 countries with younger median ages. I think 8 of them are under 18. And of that, nearly 39% of those are children under 14 years old. It's difficult to know how many are in the 15 to 17 bracket because they're lumped in with adults, and perhaps that is an issue as well. In late August of this year, the head of Gaza's government media office stated that at least 16,480 Palestinian children had been killed since the 7th of October, with more than 17,000 children losing at least one parent. And the British charity Save the Children estimated that at least 3,000 of those were under 5 years old. 20,000 are unaccompanied, and approximately 4,000 children, or rather children's bodies, are likely missing under the rubble, although it's impossible to give an estimate, an accurate estimate. According to the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies, the Israeli Defense Force claims that around 17,000 Hamas and other enemy combatants have been killed to date. 17,000 seems to repeat itself a lot as an estimate. Maybe it's just a coincidence. But those figures undoubtedly include children, because the Israeli Defense Force classifies children as young as 12 years old as carrying out ancillary military duties and participating in direct combat, whereas the Gazan Authority figures count all deaths under 18 as child civilian deaths. So we have a real conflict between even how we count civilian children in competing sets of statistics. But pursuant to the 1989 Convention on the Rights of the Child, a child means every human being under the age of 18, unless under the law applicable to the child, majority is attained earlier. The Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols, however, use different age limits, with respect to different protective measures for children. However, they enumerate additional specific rights and guarantees for newborn infants and children under 12 and under 15. Article 38 of the Children's Convention provides protection in times of armed conflict by referring state parties to humanitarian law, which they undertake to respect, and to its first optional protocol prescribing the use of conscription of children under 16 in armed conflicts, whether that's state armies or non-state organizations. Virtually all children in Gaza have experienced significant trauma, including the bereavement of family, friends, and neighbors. Death, as we've heard from Yumna, is all pervasive. This enduring loss and trauma is physical for many, through life-changing injuries, unanesthetized emergency surgery, multiple amputations, and for all, a deep psychological distress and harm that is, as I said, life-changing and most likely permanent. Vanishingly few have been evacuated or otherwise permitted to leave the area for treatment or care beyond the Gaza Strip. The fundamental rights of all children, as set out in the Convention, including the right to family unity, to survival and to development, to health, psychological care and recovery, are made almost impossible. In July, a joint UN Special Rapporteur's expert investigation published its report, finding that famine has spread through the Gaza Strip, and the majority of malnutrition and lack of access to healthcare deaths have been children, and further found that starvation was a deliberate campaign. In September, one of the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child's periodic report experts said that it could be assumed that bodies of many children were still under the rubble, and asked the Israeli government representative when those bodies could be recovered and identified, and what assistance it would give to remove the debris, what the Israeli government was doing to reunite unaccompanied children with parents and families, what was being done to protect 20,000 orphans. And it went on to ask a number of detailed other questions specific to the articles and obligations found in the Children's Convention, notably about the prohibition of killing and injury to children, attacks on schools, education and medical facilities, the use of explosive weapons within densely populated areas, ill treatment, torture of children, and many other questions. It asked about the risk of exposure to malnutrition, the outbreak of epidemics, medical complications, inadequate medical care and rehabilitation, and the deaths and long-term health risks for babies born under such conditions. In responding, Israel's ambassador to the United Nations said that the toll that this unwanted war has taken on children in Israel and in Gaza is tragic. Israel is dedicated to addressing the all too many hardships this war has imposed on Israeli children. At the same time, we're not indifferent to the suffering of children in Gaza. We are going to great lengths to facilitate the transfer of humanitarian aid to those in need. In light of Israel's responses, written and oral, and the continued armed activities that were happening at the time of that hearing, the committee expressed great concern about the number of children in Gaza killed, maimed, injured, missing, displaced, orphaned, and subjected to famine, malnutrition, and disease. It described the state parties' attacks as indiscriminate and disproportionate, and it urged the state to immediately cease the killing and injuring of Palestinian children and to ensure safe and unrestricted humanitarian access to the Strip. And it's also asked that construction materials be enabled to be brought in for Palestinians to rebuild homes and civilian and public infrastructure. For my own part, like millions of others, I've seen almost daily for a year now images and videos on social media and from the Al Jazeera journalists inside Gaza, over 160 of whom have already been killed, the most explicit images of violent deaths, of unrecognizable bodies, eviscerated remains of once bodies, including those of the very youngest children, as limp as rags and wrapped in the same, carried by grieving, distraught parents or laid out in rows, whole families at a time. These images are no ordinary war or conflict. No reasonable person could describe what we see as precision targeting, limited damage, proportionate, accidental, collateral, incidental harm to civilians. I've got 2 or 3 minutes left, so I'm just going to see what I should really emphasize. I think in closing, so that we can have a discussion, I would just say that the media loosely characterizes this conflict as a war, but within the complex historical and shifting legal status of Palestine and Israel, it's arguable that the October 7th attacks were an act of internal terrorism, not war, and that the response to such atrocities rest not within the international laws of war, but the laws relating to terrorism, that is to say, matters of an occupying state's policing of criminality rather than a military response. But as Ben Saul, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and States' Responses to Terrorism, has said recently, it doesn't really matter very much to the international humanitarian law question, because whether or not Israel has powers to defend its people under the law of occupation or under a self-defense paradigm, it must always respect international humanitarian law. It can't somehow pull out self-defense as a trump card to set aside international humanitarian law. This is now also a matter of compliance with the 3 sets of provisional measures ordered, and I repeat the word order because it is a judicial order by the International Court of Justice, pending the final determination of South Africa's proceedings on the allegations of genocide. Its 3rd order of May 24th required urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to be unhindered and provided at scale. And those provisional measures have a binding effect and create international legal obligations for any party when the provisional measures are addressed, where those provisional measures are addressed. This is the only binding judicial decision on the conflict at all so far, but so far it hasn't been complied with. And I think to end the most, for me, shocking in terms of legal responses to the Committee on the Rights of the Child was its position that Israel takes the view that human rights conventions only apply within territories in which the state applies its sovereignty. And it takes the view that the CRC, the convention, doesn't apply in this context. And it only is concerned with humanitarian law. That it's opting out of wholesale international universally agreed conventions is concerning. So I close just by saying that whatever the international courts eventually determine, the children who survive this conflict will be history's future judges. And we can only hope that they construct a better future than this horrific present that they have had forced upon them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all three of you also for sticking with the time. It was an easy task for me. I want to we have around 15 minutes for discussions, so I want to open the floor for questions. So we might gather at least two questions. Please, behind you, Thomas.
Thank you all so much for this panel. I agree with Laurent. It was quite heartbreaking, but also I think not to have opened up a space to talk about Gaza would have felt like a form of erasure almost. So thank you for the work you're all doing and your thoughts. I had a question, I think mainly for Yumna, which is as catastrophic as, I guess, as much as October 7th and its aftermath are a break in history and a new, completely catastrophic genocidal phase, I'm sure this is due to constraints of time, but there's a way in which your presentation could almost make it seem like the before was this moment where Palestinian deathways were somehow had all this cultural integrity and we're just proceeding, sort of in this ideal fashion. And I couldn't help, I'm not an expert in the region, but I couldn't help but imagine that Israeli apartheid, constrictions on movement, surveillance, imprisonment, all the things that were already kind of everyday violence prior to October 7th, must also have shaped, constrained, informed whatever we might understand as a specifically Palestinian deathway. And so I was wondering, not in any way to sort of diminish the importance of everything you presented and of understanding the current catastrophe through the lens of the unimaginable disruption of people's grieving process and their deathways. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more, though, about deathways under occupation even before October 7th.
Thank you for the question, and I'll try my best to address your question. There are several ways. There have been many studies done by Ismail Nashif and Suhad Zahir on the Palestinian body and how Israel as a colonial power controls the dead and the body, and how they wanna control even the dead body of the Palestinian, especially the whole notion of martyrdom, because Palestinians treat those assassinated by Israel as martyrs. Yes, Gaza is a very specific case. Gaza has been 16 years. It's the most densely populated spot on the whole earth. It's closed, blocked by sea, by air, by earth. But still, we never seen such proportion of death in Gaza. We never. This is the 5th war that Israel launched on Gaza, but still people managed to have a shroud, to have space in the cemetery, to bury their dead. Here is dead. Imagine someone is burying his child in his house on the sidewalk. You cannot to open mass graves because they are shelling the pieces, like the different ways of dead. I think it was unexperienced. You know what I mean? It's like the shredded bodies of father collecting, weighing pieces of bodies and telling you this is unprecedented. But the whole notion, yes, especially for the people in the Gaza Strip, things have been challenging. And actually, the chief of the Red Cross and the Médecins Sans Frontières, they were saying sometimes you come and wonder, how are the Gazans surviving this? From where do they get their resilience? And he said, it's the Gazans. So your question is super valid. But this current war and the different ways of death, and especially if this morning there was a question about religion, if you contextualize it within religious Muslim society and the importance of the dead and the care of the body, it's unprecedented. I hope I managed to give you an idea.
Well, thank you very much. Are there any other questions wanted to ask? It's the end of the day. But yeah, Thomas.
I've got one for the from a law point of view. I think that the decision of the International Court of Justice is to decide there was a plausible risk of genocide. And can you remind us what are the criteria of this decision? What are the boxes to be checked to qualify it as a
No, sit.
Sit.
I will, because I don't have it in front of me. Sorry. So I'm not going to pretend to sort of make up the criteria for plausibility. I could put the judgment up and we could have a look. But I think one of the things that we were very keen to do was actually not address this issue of labeling what is happening right now. In my position, it doesn't matter to children whether they're killed as an act of genocide or any other form of violence, and no child is living in fear of what happens, bearing in mind its definition. Our concern right now is that there are very few venues for the litigation of the meaning of anything in relation to what happens, and they're certainly not quick. And when we get round to finally determining whether or not this was genocide, we could be years down the road. I hope we're not, but historically, those things take a great amount of time. And I think what is unique about the International Court of Justice in this case is how swiftly it moved in terms of its other interim powers to determine the kinds of measures that it could impose without any finding or conclusion that it was or will be considered to be a genocide. So I think my bigger concern is the attacks on the integrity of the court, the attacks on it both physically, not physically, kind of rhetorically, but also we know that it's been spied on. We know that political pressures have been put on for it not to do certain things. Our own government, we had a change of government recently in the UK, but the previous government used language like it was very unhelpful, but diplomatic language still has the same impact. It's a very sort of icy kind of thing to start criticizing the mandate of the court. And we've seen that across all the UN institutions that are really, really threatened by this at the moment. So I think for me, genocide is somewhere off the table right now. We can look at what is happening, and I think that's what we've tried to focus on, actually happening, and lawyers can argue in a court of law and judges can find on that. But there is an order in place for immediate humanitarian assistance and for the cessation of violence, and that is being ignored, and I think that's the biggest, most urgent concern. So sorry, that's ducking the question and revealing my ignorance of the criteria.
Fiona is still looking for that. In the meantime, are there other questions?
Sorry, I should have said I deliberately didn't focus on that aspect because I wanted to really focus on civilians and not draw us into an adversarial sort of approach this afternoon. So that's why I haven't got it to hand. I apologise, but it can be sent.
Maybe take this one. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. It was hard to follow you, but not because it was indeed a terrible topic. And but thank you for being here and also for reporting what's going on in Gaza. It's always very important to hear that and not forget for any moment what is going on. I have a question regarding rituals, maybe in a kind of naive way. In my cases in Sicily, sometimes I see how in these unusual circumstances towards the border death, locals adapt traditional practices towards like the new circumstances. And so I'm analyzing it as the tradition that recreates new way of mourning and burials for example, in my case, the stranger. And I saw in your presentation that the real impossibility of burials and the real impossibility of process the mourning through that very first act of burying your once loved one. But are there, have you seen other types of funerary practices that act in the absence of this very element? Like in the circumstances of the war, are there other moments in which the funerary rituals can perform, although there's no the burials itself?
Okay, we have reports that on evaporated bodies, like, some of the studies by forensic architecture and the investigation team of Al Jazeera, that we don't know what type of weapon that causes the evaporation of the bodies. So we have some evidence and some reports about evaporated bodies. What happens? There is no rituals, because Muslims believe that when death happens, is the soul leaves the body. The body is a vehicle of the soul. The body dies, but the soul, we don't know what happens. They say the soul went, there is a verse in the Quran when the Christian community in Arabia asked Muhammad, they ask you what happens to the soul after death. Tell them that the soul is an issue of God. Only God knows what happens to the soul. So it's the belief, it's like practice and belief. And believers believe, the Muslims and the Gazans, if you have the body, you have to purify it and you have to prepare it so it's gonna meet God. It's something pure. There are some other religions that they treat the dead body as impure, while in Islam, no, you purify it, you prepare it because it's gonna meet God. So, but if there is no body, there is no ritual. There are prayers. You pray for mercy and on the soul of the dead. So, for example, the evaporated bodies, you have no remains, no traces. Those with the school and the dawn attack, when they were pieces, but just to show you how desperate they are, they collected the pieces and they waited, they buried it. So there's the prayer, but the most important thing, if you have any remains of the body, it has to be buried. This is honor. This is the best respect you could give to the dead, is to bury their remains. But if there's no body, you just do the prayer. I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Hi, so thank you for the the presentations. Of course, very, very intense. But I do have a question that might actually apply to a couple of you. So while we were talking, Yahya Sinwar was supposedly assassinated. But what happened immediately is the body was taken from the conflict area. It was supposedly an open conflict in Rafah, and was taken to Israel for DNA testing, essentially to confirm if it was him that died or not. So in essence, I suppose, like Yahya's, half an hour ago. It just happened, yeah, while you guys were talking, so you couldn't have known. But the body is Israel has announced it, but they're quite sure, I guess it's him. In essence, and yeah, his body was taken obviously to the other side for DNA testing to confirm that it's him. In this instance, as a combatant, I guess, right? Does he have the same rights, funerary rights as well, as the civilians we were speaking of? And what happens in this case as well? Of course.
There's something you should Okay, this is a very, okay. During wartime, usually if Israel assassinates, let's say, Yahya, Sheikh Yassin, or what was his name who was assassinated, Ismail Haniya in Tehran, if Israel intentionally targets someone and they call him Shaheed, they don't wash him, they don't shroud him exactly with his body and his clothes, they are wrapped with the flag and buried. Like the Shaheed does not get washed nor shrouded. But when during a war, they refer to these civilians as Shaheeds, but at the beginning of the war, they tried to wash and shroud. But no, it didn't work because of the circumstances they stopped. So, of course, he died. You know, I don't think he will be washed. He will just be buried. You know, of course, they will refer to him as Shaheed.
Thank you.
But I think that the issue here is more linked to international law rather than to Islamic law, especially since the fact that the body will very unlikely be returned. And how does the fact that the body is like Osama bin Laden's corpse potentially thrown in the ocean? But I think that the Americans at the time had at least given a kind of varnish when it came to respecting rituals, right? But it's not clear if the Israelis will do that. But I think it's more a matter of
I found it cost
law, right?
to be honest. Yeah, huh? But yeah, I would say that I would also appreciate your perspective. If you have
but
it.
how does a civilian corpse? According to law, how is it treated differently from a combatant corpse? That's
well, in terms of the right to dignity, is the same. So, in fact, what we saw in Abu Ghraib, in Guantanamo, in the execution and overthrow with regime change in places was, that total denial of dignity in the way that we treat enemy combatants led to all kinds of further atrocities. It's there for a good reason that we maintain the dignity of our enemies. So there's no difference.
But politically speaking, sometimes, they don't want the site of burial for these people to become a commemorating site for people. That's why what they did for Bin Laden, I don't know what they will do for...
They buried him at sea, right? Bin Laden, right?
They threw him at sea, I think.
And he was buried at sea.
I got two microphones. I think this wraps up the day. Thank you all for being here until this last session. I expect that you will gather in the same room tomorrow. Tomorrow at 9:30. Thank you all, and have a nice evening.